You know, it's a very contentious point, what would qualify as the quote unquote golden age of Yu Gi Oh! A lot of people, myself included, have really tried diving deeper into the question of what could be determined to be the, once again, quote unquote, best format to exist. From a subjective standpoint, of course. The elements that go into what makes a truly great format varies greatly from person to person based on deck building attributes, gameplay, and varying levels of diversity within a format. However, that is not the discussion I'm here to have today. What I wanted to talk to you all about today is what I consider to be Yu-Gi-Oh's darkest moments, the worst part of the game's history by my personal standard, and how it came to be, and why I believe it will not actually be possible that we get to a point so intensely mismanaged again. Keep in mind when you're listening and hearing me recount this format and all of the flaws within it, that this is going to be an opinionated piece, and my recount of this point in Yu-Gi-Oh! History has incorporated my own personal bias into it. However, I certainly don't want this to be a closed-ended discussion. If you disagree with what I have to say and the points that I make, please leave a comment and let's talk about it. It all stemmed from one point. Off the heels of a ban list devastating spiral as we enter the era of COVID, the TCG received Duel Overload. If you don't recall much about this set exactly, I can summarize it as the amalgamation of Konami's procrastination. For a little background, leading up to this point, a wide array of the most powerful Link monsters printed to date had not been imported as we came up to Eternity Code, the end of the Vrains era. Konami North America had to give us Link monsters that they had yet to import one way or another. Duel Overload was the medium for that import project, giving us Halqifibrax, Verte, Union Carrier, Simorgh, Dagda, and Mecha Phantom Beast Auroradon, just to name a few. It didn't help that all these game-warping cards were entered into the game as we entered the era of online Yu-Gi-Oh! With no in-person Konami-sponsored events, the majority of the competitive player base had shifted to playing on Dueling Book primarily, giving Konami little to no reason to even deliver ban lists, as they didn't have the game running on any official capacity at this point in time. To Konami's credit, they had attempted to derail Duel Overload's impact with a host of preemptive bans within Steam the Cloak, Destrudo, and Glow-Up-Bulb. These preemptive hits were ineffective in stopping the impact of Duel Overload, to say the least, however. Now admittedly, a lot of powerful Link monsters had been released, but most of the powerful archetypes that had existed in the previous formats had been gutted. So theoretically, the mediums for these cards to be exploited were not readily obvious. From a developer standpoint, the game on release of Duel Overload, with the accompanying preemptive hits, was not a particularly out-of-hand format. This was an understandable argument speaking in a vacuum. Unfortunately, Konami had failed to consider the context of the time period at which these cards were being released, and a month later, we received Secret Slayers, a set that provided players with the perfect medium to abuse the new Link monsters we had been given. It took the community a moment or two to figure out how to properly build and play the Eldritch and Adamancipator strategies. Originally, a lot of people were playing things like Alistair as a supporting engine to Eldritch, or just packing a lot of Floodgates. The Adamancipator lists were also not particularly fleshed out on release, seeing a lot of different engines experimented with. However, once people started testing more extensively with the Halqifibrax package, it quickly became the primary Eldritch supporting engine. At the same time, more and more combo lines for Adamancipator had been worked with, the decks both quickly becoming the focal points of the format. The one-card combo potential from cards like Jet Synchron allowed Eldritch, which would otherwise just be a simple, grindy trap deck, the ability to functionally FTK if they went uninterrupted turn 1. The power to go from a single Jet Synchron into Mecha Phantom Beast Auroradon cannot be understated, and many of the baseline combos were leaving the turn player going +4 or +5 off a simple normal summon. The pace at which synchro combos were growing only accelerated when we received the main set Eternity Code in June of 2020. With the release of Link Cross, Halqifibrax combos had only grown more powerful and more flexible. There was a multitude of different lines Eldritch players had adapted to using, and with the introduction of Link Cross, Adamancipator had grown stronger as well. Halqifibrax Link Cross combos were particularly dangerous in Adamancipator. allowing for early combo Herald of Arclights to come down consistently. With the added variance of Kowakimaru Guardian in the deck as both a normal summon and an excavate target, the deck developed a reputation for being terribly unpredictable and incredibly difficult to interact with when you were going second. Hand traps were generally only reliably strong against the deck in multiples. Therein lies one of the biggest issues of the format. Because Adamancipator had so many ways of shutting down hand traps, the natural progression of thought would be to play cards like Dark Ruler No More to answer the boards the deck was building. Unfortunately, Adamancipator had incorporated Union Carrier into its inboard, another Link monster Dual Overload had introduced. This backed the powerful negate boards with an equipped copy of Dragon Buster Destruction Sword, locking the opponent out of the extra deck through board breakers like Dark Ruler No More. This made deck building in the format extremely frustrating. Eldritch one-card combos demanded you to draw hand traps to stop their main lines of play, as they would normally use Halqifibrax lines to accrue large amounts of advantage turn 1. And in the same breath, you wanted to answer decks like Adamancipator with multiple board breakers in hopes for being able to manage the large amount of power they were able to produce. All of this frustration built to a June ban list that people had hoped would introduce at least some limit to the extreme power creep that the game had experienced within the prior months. Unfortunately, with the lack of official Konami events on hand at this point, the ban list Konami introduced quite literally chose to do nothing, unlimiting 3 monsters that were widely irrelevant to the metagame and touching none of the cards the community was upset about. Specifically, Block Dragon, being untouched, had players definitely up in arms. The outrage towards Konami's decisions to keep the format in the unhealthy and stale state it had built itself to be was controversial to say the least. Pro Play Games, one of the more popular online tournaments of the digital age, even tried hosting tournaments under their own custom ban list for a few tournaments in the wake of Konami's decision to leave the metagame completely untouched. Konami had truly taken a blind eye to the online player base, which at this point was essentially the entire competitive landscape. The format up to this point was absolutely a tribute to Konami's negligence and unwillingness to address events that extended past their quote-unquote official curtain. The format was wrecked by unbalanced, unaddressed cards that demanded more draw-the-out gameplay than I have ever seen before or since. With lack of Konami support, no in-person locals, and a player base clawing to Dueling Book, the game was in a frail state to say the least. As the format went on, Battles of Legend Armageddon was released alongside Rise of the Duelist. These sets only contributed to the quote-unquote draw-the-out style of play that was already present in the format. Battles of Legend made way for one-card Utopic Zexal, and Rise of the Duelist fleshed out Infernoble, another powerful abuser of Halqifibrax Link Cross combos. The game devolved more and more into a mess of the most powerful combo decks the game has ever seen slamming their heads against one another. The issue with playing board breakers versus hand traps that I mentioned earlier was only further pressed by Infernoble. The deck would actually look at the opponent's hand with Smoke Grenade of the Thief, further shoving haymakers out of the format as they would simply be invalidated by Dragon Buster or Smoke Grenade. This was the pinnacle of the mess Konami had made. A format overridden by unprecedented power levels, frustrating deck building philosophies, and very little room for powerful displays of technical play. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has never felt as die roll dependent to me as it did in this format. Pairing all of this with the fact that there was no access to real in-person events at this point, completely eliminating the social element of the game, and it truly did feel like a format deserving of the title of Yu-Gi-Oh's worst format. Thankfully, we have been able to move past this section of Yu-Gi-Oh! History, with most of the powerful cards from this era since being dealt with over the long period of time since Dual Overload's inception. Dual Overload and its consequences on modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Were long and strenuous, and truly I do hope that Yu-Gi-Oh! Never undergoes a period quite like this one ever again. But I do understand that everyone's going to have a different perspective on this format, and I'd love to hear in the comments how you felt playing during this period of the game. Was this an era you equally disliked, or were there elements you appreciated that I seem to have overlooked? Let's have a conversation. I'd love to get some different outlooks on the format. And until next time, guys, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.